Morning. So today we're going to be looking at free will and determinism as one of the issues and debates on paper 3, and this is for obviously Psychology AQA paper 3, which is coming up on Monday. So we're going to be looking at free will, determinism, and essentially it's this idea is whether our behaviour is down to free will, as in we have choice over everything, or is it predetermined to other factors which are outside of our control. And then we'll apply that to the different approaches that we've been looking at and the different topics as we've gone through to see how sort of where they sit. So in terms of our definitions, free will is the idea that humans have choice over their own thoughts and actions, and the only approach that really advocates this is the humanistic approach. So just when you're going into your exam, know these kind of key definitions. This is your AO1, this is your description, so you can just get a 2-marker explaining what free will is, or a 2-marker defining determinism, maybe a multiple choice question. These are all key facts that you can include, and then obviously on an 8-marker or a 16-marker, this is your AO1 that you just need to know. So the determinism definition is that it suggests that free will has no place in explaining behaviour, but there are two kind of versions, hard and a soft version. So hard suggests that all behaviour has a cause, and in theory it should be possible to explain these causes. So it's kind of everything is down to scientific factors or things that are outside of our control. Everything is predetermined. And then soft determinism is put forward by William James, and that scientists suggest that cause for our behaviour, but we still have freedom to choose our behaviour. And the approach that advocates this more is the cognitive approach. So we may suffer from depression, or we may be predetermined to suffer from depression, but we can help overcome that by attending cognitive behavioural therapy and help with our treatments for that. So this table is one that I've pulled together, which is like an overview of the different types of determinism. And again, this would be very keeping for AO1 on an 8-marker or a 16-marker. So, and they're all nice. You just learn the terms, and you'll have learned all of this content. So the terms just go with the description. So again, it's just developing your description to be able to get that sort of extra content, and that's where you'll be picking up those marks. So biological determinism shows the importance of biological systems on how we react to stress. So again, we don't have control over our, say for our fight or flight, or our heart rate, our temperature gauge. So that's all controlled through the autonomic nervous system. It's automatic, and that's therefore where it's biological. Even things like our gender, how it's determined in the womb, the amount of hormones that we are exposed to in the womb. Obviously, our parents have a little bit of choice over that, but not really. So that's your biological determinism. And then you've got environmental determinism. So Skinner described free will as an illusion. So again, this is opposing this idea of free will. But instead of being biologically determined, it's down to the environment, so factors in our environment. And therefore, Skinner said that all behaviour is a result of conditioning or learning. So again, what we're exposed to from our environment. And then psychic determinism sounds a little bit of a strange word, because obviously it's sort of psychic, but that's from the psychodynamic approach. Also believe that free will is an illusion. So all of these are saying that free will is an illusion, but for different reasons, okay? So you could get asked a question asking you the differences in sort of similarities and differences within determinism. So with the psychodynamic approach, they emphasize the importance of the biological drives and instincts, and all behavior is determined by unconscious conflicts that are repressed in childhood. So again, we don't have control over that according to this approach, and therefore they're saying that there's no such thing as an accident. Something as random as a slip of the tongue can be explained by the unconscious. So everything is outside of our control. So the scientific emphasis, so all of the deterministic approaches are attempting to be scientific. So obviously the only one that really isn't is the psychodynamic approach. But remember, Freud was working as a scientist, as a doctor, it was just that he kind of the times that he was working in were less scientific principles than we have today, and he kind of got very lost in this idea of the unconscious mind, which went against the scientific principles. So basic principles of science is that every event in the universe has a cause and effect and will be explained by general laws. So that's worth knowing. Cause and effect, this is worth knowing just for a 2-marker on scientific emphasis, okay, scientific principles. I've noted down some hunches, ideas that I think may come up. One of them is features of a science, so theory and hypothesis testing. So this would fit into that. So developing a theory, then you're establishing to see how accurate that is through writing your hypothesis, your experimental hypothesis, your null hypothesis, and seeing if cause and effect will occur. So by knowing the cause of behaviour or event, scientists can make predictions for the future. So lab experiments are used to study human behaviour in a scientific way, and obviously they have your independent variable and your dependent variable, which is then measured. So this I've pulled together as a kind of like strengths and limitations. I tried to do kind of strengths and limitations, but obviously we've got free will and determinism, so it then became a little bit complicated. So just look at it as more kind of like a structure for an essay. So I'll just talk through it. So I have kept the strengths of free will here, and then the limitations of free will, but then it flips to become the strengths of determinism. So free will has got good practical value. So Roberts et al. In 2000 studied adolescents comparing their levels of control, so controlling what they felt they had in their life, and they found that those that thought they had less control, so often considered like an internal locus of control, were significantly more depressed than those that felt they had, those that had less control, so that should be external, so they had less control over their outcomes, were significantly more depressed than those who had more control. So the more control you have over a situation means that you are less depressed. So just ignore this little typo here. But another strength of free will is the position that the legal system has on responsibility. So in a court of law, offenders are held responsible for their actions. So we don't allow free will, determinism. We say that people have made that choice. So the main principle of our legal system is that a defendant exercised their free will in committing the crime. Therefore, deterministic arguments do not work. You can't go in and say, I've got the gene for being very aggressive or criminal gene, that doesn't work in a court of law. So there's brain scan evidence which supports determinism and not free will. So Libet instructed participants to choose a random moment to flick their wrist, and they had to say when they consciously thought about the moment, but they also did brain scans at the same time, and they showed that there were changes in the brain area before they thought to do the movement. So this shows that, or it's an argument to say that our free will is governed by our brain before it occurs. But then you could say that the brain is governing that decision. So then that is, I would say, an argument for still free will, but it's saying that there is something that's difficult for us to measure that changes within the brain before we actually make that conscious decision. So determinism has helped establish psychology as a science as well. So hard determinism has helped establish many effective and real-world applications, including therapies and behavioural interventions. But free will has got a good intuitive appeal. Most of us see ourselves as making our own choices rather than being pushed by forces outside of our control. So I think most people like the idea of free will, but actually there's an element to say that things are predetermined outside of our actual control. Okay, so that then brings us on to the nature-nurture debate. So is behaviour down to nature, so how we are born, or nurture, how we are raised? Again, this kind of crosses over into sort of free will determinism, because obviously nature and nurture is kind of how we're, again, kind of, I suppose it's very deterministic, but it's whether we're born in a certain way or obviously environmental factors. Just want to point out as well, in terms of essay questions, so soft determinism came up as a 2-marker in 2022, so last year, but it hasn't come up as a longer essay, an 8-marker or 16-marker. Free will determinism hasn't come up as a question. since 2008, since before 2018. It's never come up. So definitely go over that. Have a look at the video, the early part of this video. Have a little look in the textbook as well, and just sort of see if you can develop any of those evaluation points. Okay, nature nurture similarly came up in 2019, which was obviously the last year prior to COVID restrictions, teacher assessed grades, and we're going back to that level of assessment this year. So I'm not saying that would definitely come up, but that was a 16 marker in 2019. So potentially that could come up as a shorter question, or they could repeat it again. It's very hard to predict paper questions at A level, but sometimes you can sort of start to pick up a little bit of a pattern occurring. So the nature nurture debate, so I'm sure you're all aware the definitions for nature is inherited or hereditary characteristics. So this was put forward by Descartes, who was around in 1596 to 1650, and he stated that all human characteristics and some knowledge are innate. He suggests that psychological characteristics are innate, as are physical characteristics. So he said that the two were very similar and work together. So nurture, however, refers to the influence of experience and environment. So John Locke stated that we are born as a blank slate from birth, and therefore we are shaped by our environment. So one of the key ways that we measure nature and nurture are through a correlation coefficient, which is known as a concordance rate. So this is where we look at twins and we compare MZ and DZ twins. So obviously you would have looked at this within the biological approach. And then once they look at concordance rates of both twin developing the traits, so be it depression, schizophrenia, intelligence, eye colour, hair colour, if they both develop that trait, then and they compare that development with MZ and DZ. If it's high concordance for MZ twins but lower for DZ twins, then it's likely to be down to nature and down to the genes. But if it's similar, then there's going to be other factors involved, so they can't say that that's down to genes. Or obviously if it's higher for DZ, then there's something else going on. So just have a little look over twin studies as well. So today we look at the idea that it's an interactionist approach. So very much sort of prior to the development of brain scans, it was still considered, oh, is it down to nature? Are we down to nurture? It's got to be one or the other. But now we know that actually the two work together. And obviously you can use your knowledge from functional recovery after trauma or brain plasticity to show that actually the more that we learn about something, the more we focus on something, the more that certain areas of our brain develop, and be that sort of negative habits or positive sort of habits. So it's considered that the interactionist approach joins nature and nurture together. And again, you'll have come across this. It's referred to as the diathesis stress model, where a biological vulnerability is likely to only be expressed when it's combined with environmental trigger. So we may carry a biological vulnerability towards depression or OCD or addiction or into high intelligence, but when we have that environment that helps us to develop that, is when we can sort of avoid something, or it could trigger it. So furthermore, epigenetics refers to a change in our genetic activity that happens throughout our life. So certain aspects such as trauma, war or smoking can switch certain genes off. So the effect continues way after the event or the habit has stopped. So it means that actually we may still be predisposed to something, which means we may develop it or we may not develop it. But that can then be transferred into the genetic codes of our children. So into our sort of our offspring, where we've got a genetic predisposition towards say depression, we've not developed it, but then it's gone on to our offspring. So that's kind of like a sometimes like an environmental factor. So trauma, war, are things that have happened within our environment, but then they've triggered the change in our genes that can then be developed over time. So our AO3 of the nature-nurture debate, again, we're looking at kind of the discussion of this debate, the merits of the debate, support from topics that you've looked at throughout your course. So please go into this exam not forgetting everything from paper 1 and paper 2, because it's really important that you can use this in these discussion essays. So one strength comes from adoption studies. These separate the competing influences of nature and nurture. So if an adopted children are more similar to their adoptive parents, this suggests that the environment, the way that they're raised, is a bigger influence. If they're more similar to their biological parents, then nature must be more influential. So an alternative means that the two can't be directly separated. So Plomin suggests that people create their own nurture by selecting environments that match their nature. So Plomin refers to this as niche picking. Examples include aggression, crime, addiction. So you may sort of be raised in a certain family, and then there's certain factors that mean that you select that friendship groups that are then going to sort of increase your chances to becoming aggressive or addictive. So furthermore, strength comes from epigenetics, which I referred to earlier. So research here comes from the Second World War, where an area in Holland was starved and 22,000 people died. Women who were pregnant, who fell pregnant at the time, went on to have low birth weight babies, and obviously you would expect that. But these babies were also twice as likely to develop schizophrenia compared to the norm, so compared to children or people that hadn't gone through this situation. So something in this lack of diet or the trauma meant that they were then more likely to develop schizophrenia. And then furthermore, the nature-nurture debate has important real-world applications. So, for example, OCD has got a high genetic component, could be up to 0.76. So if we know this, people can put things in place to help prevent the development of the disorder. So, for example, stress management and knowing how to be aware of triggers and cues for the illness. Okay, so that is the end of part 2. So looking at the nature-nurture and free will and determinism debate. So looking at those two debates, as I say, don't use this as your full revision. This is just an overview, chance for you to recap, make notes, see if there's anything you can add into your own notes. I will go through at the end of the last video just a discussion on some of the questions that have come up before, so that you can just be aware of that. And have a look on the AQA website because they've got all the past papers there, so you can have a look through those past papers and mark schemes. All right, good luck, and please like and subscribe so you can see when the next revision slides come up.